In June 1969, when the astronauts had put the first human footprints on the moon, the father of that achievement, Werner von Braun, announced to the press a U.S. plan for a remote space station with functions that were less remote. He heralded an observation platform from which we will be able to examine all the wealth of the Earth, including unknown petroleum, copper, and zinc deposits. Petroleum continues to be our world's chief fuel, and the United States imports 1/7 of the petroleum it consumes. Bullets are needed to kill Vietnamese, and bullets need copper. The United States buys abroad 1/5 of the copper it uses. Shortages of zinc cause increasing anxiety. Over half comes from abroad. Planes cannot be built without aluminum, and aluminum cannot be produced without bauxite. The United States has almost no bauxite. Its great steel centers, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit, do not get enough iron from the Minnesota deposits, which are on the way to exhaustion. And there is no manganese within the United States. 1/3 of its iron, all of its manganese are imported. Nor has it any nickel or chrome of its own to produce jet engines. Tungsten is needed to make special steels, and 1/4 of that is imported. This growing dependence on foreign supplies produces the growing identification of the interests of U.S. capitalists operating in Latin America with U.S. national security. The internal stability of the world's greatest power is closely linked with its investments south of the Rio Grande. About half of those investments are in the extraction of petroleum and minerals, indispensable for the U.S. economy in peace and war. In 1959, the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce International Department said, "Historically, one of the United States' chief reasons for investing abroad has been to develop natural resources, particularly minerals and more especially petroleum. It is quite obvious that incentives for this type of investment can only grow. Our needs for raw materials are continually increasing as the population expands and living standards rise. At the same time, our domestic resources are depleted. Government, universities, and big corporations invest astronomical amounts in scientific laboratories, which make new discoveries and inventions at a dizzy pace. But the new technology still has not found a substitute for the basic materials nature alone provides. At the same time, the materials necessary to meet the challenge of its industrial growth become increasingly scarce in the United States' own subsoil. The wealth of iron beneath Brazil's Paraopeba Valley overthrew two presidents, Jânio Quadros and João Goulart, before Marshal Castelo Branco, who made himself dictator in 1964, graciously handed it over to the Hana Mining Company. An earlier friend of the U.S. ambassador, President Eurico Dutra, 1946 to 51, had handed Bethlehem Steel the 40 million tons of manganese in the state of Amapá, one of the world's biggest deposits, for 4% of the income from exporting it. Since then, Bethlehem has been moving the mountains to the United States so enthusiastically that in 15 years' time, Brazil may have no manganese for its own steel industry. Furthermore, thanks to the generosity of the Brazilian government, $88 out of the each $100 Bethlehem invests in mineral extraction are tax exempt in the name of, quote, regional development. As we can see, the experience of the lost gold of Minas Gerais, white gold, black gold, rotten gold, as the poet Manuel Bandeira wrote, has gone for nothing. Brazil continues the gratuitous self-plunder of its own natural resources of development. In Bolivia, the Matilde mine contains lead, silver, and abundant zinc 12 times more pure than that in U.S. mines. Between massacres of miners, dictator Rene Barrientos, who seized power in 1964, handed it over to Phillips Industries, a Dutch conglomerate. The firm was authorized to remove the crude zinc for processing in its refineries abroad, paying the state no less than 1.5% of the sale value. In Peru in 1968, page 11 of the agreement which President Fernando Belaúnde Terry had signed with a Standard Oil affiliate was mysteriously lost. General Juan Velasco Alvarado overthrew Belaúnde, took the reins, and nationalized the firm's wells and refinery. In Venezuela, the largest U.S. military mission in Latin America sits on Standard and Gulf's Great Petroleum Lake. Argentina's frequent coups d'etat erupt before or after each offer of oil concessions. Copper was a far from minor factor in the Pentagon's disproportionate military aid to Chile before the electoral victory of Salvador Allende's left coalition. U.S. copper reserves had fallen by more than 60% between 1965 and 1969. In 1964, Che Guevara showed me in his office in Havana that Batista's Cuba was not merely sugar. The Imperium's blind fury against the revolution was better explained, he thought, by Cuba's big deposits of nickel and manganese. The United States nickel reserves subsequently fell by 2/3 when Nicaragua nickel was nationalized and President Johnson threatened an embargo on French metal exports if the French bought nickel from Cuba. Minerals had much to do with the fall of Cheddi Jagan's socialist government, which at the end of 1964 had again won a majority of votes in what was then British Guinea. The country now called Guyana is the world's 4th producer of bauxite and Latin America's 3rd producer of manganese. The CIA played a decisive role in Jagan's defeat. Arnold Zander, leader of the strike that served as a provocation and pretext to deny electoral victory to Jagan, afterward admitted publicly that his union had dollars rained upon it from one of the CIA foundations. The new regime, very Western and very Christian, guaranteed the Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, against any danger to its interest in Guyana. It could continue tranquilly removing the bauxite and selling it to itself at the same price as in 1938. Although the price of aluminum had since soared, the danger was indeed past. Arkansas bauxite costs twice as much as Guyana bauxite. The United States has very little bauxite on its own territory, but using cheap imported raw material, it produces almost half of the world's aluminum. The United States depends on foreign sources for most of the materials it needs to maintain its ability to wage war. The jet engine, the gas turbine, and nuclear reactors have a great influence over the demand for materials only obtainable abroad, and there is a clear link between the imperative need for strategic minerals, indispensable for the maintenance of U.S. military atomic power, and the massive purchase of land, usually by fraudulent methods, in Brazil's Amazonia. During the 60s, many U.S. firms represented by professional adventurers and contrabandists descended in a hectic rush upon these enormous forests, which under an agreement signed in 1964 had already been flown over and photographed by the U.S. Air Force. Scintillometers to detect deposits of radioactive minerals, electromagnetic devices for X-ray photography of subsoils rich in non-ferrous minerals, and magnetometers to detect and measure the iron were all used. With the aid of a U.S. government geological survey, information and photos concerning the extension and depth of Amazonia's hidden wealth were put in the hands of interested private concerns. Gold, silver, diamonds, gypsum, hematite, magnetite, tantalite, titanium, thorium, bauxite, zinc, chrome, and mercury were detected, photographing everything from the virgin forest of Mato Grosso to the southern Guayas plains. The intrepid lensman, as ecstatically reported in the final Latin American edition of Time in '67, captured God's eye views showing lightning flashes of half a dozen distant storms on the same exposure as brilliant sunshine. The government had offered tax exemptions and other seductions to colonizers of these wild, magical lands. Before 1967, according to Time, foreign capitalists had bought at 7 cents an acre a tract larger than Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire put together. "We trust," said the director of the government's Amazonian Development Agency, "keep the doors wide open to foreign investment, for we need more than we can get." To justify the U.S. Air Force's aerophoto excursions, the government had previously declared it lacked the resources for the job. Again, par for the course in Latin America, its resources are always surrendered to imperialism in the name of its lack of resources. The Brazilian Congress managed to conduct an investigation which brought forth a voluminous report. In this were listed cases of sale or usurpation of 20 million odd hectares of land, forming so odd a shape that, said the investigating commission, they constitute a cordon to isolate Amazonia from the rest of Brazil. The clandestine exploitation of highly valuable materials appears in the report as one of the United States' chief motives for opening, quote, new frontier in Brazil. Army testimony stresses, quote, the interest of the U.S. government in maintaining under its control a vast tract of land for later use, whether for exploitation of minerals, especially radioactive ones, or as a base for organized colonization, end quote, says the National Security Council. Quote, a suspicious factor is that the areas occupied or being occupied by foreign elements are the same areas where sterilization campaigns for Brazilian women are carried on by foreigners, end quote. In fact, according to the newspaper Correio da Manhã, quote, more than 20 foreign religious missions, mainly of the U.S. Protestant Church, are occupying Amazonia, functioning in places that are richest in radioactive minerals, gold, and diamonds. They make extensive use of sterilization using the intrauterine device and teach English to the catechized Indians. Their areas are surrounded by armed elements and no one can enter them, end quote. Note that Amazonia is the largest of all habitable deserts on our planet. Birth control has been introduced into this great empty space to avoid demographic competition by the very few Brazilians who live and reproduce in remote corners of the immense forests and plains. General Rio Grandino Cruel told the Congressional Investigating Commission that contraband in materials containing thorium and uranium amounts to an astronomical 1 million tons. Shortly before, in 1966, Cruel, then federal police chief, had denounced a U.S. consul's insolent and systematic interference, quote, in the open trial of 4 U.S. citizens' Brazilian atomic minerals. To the general's mind, the fact that 40 tons of radioactive minerals had been found in their possession was enough to convict them. Soon afterward, 3 of the contrabandists mysteriously fled the country. The smuggling was no new phenomenon, although it had greatly increased. Through clandestine leakage of rough diamonds alone, Brazil has for some years been losing more than 100 million a year. But the need to smuggle is only relative. Legal concessions deprive Brazil without any inconvenience of most of its fabulous natural wealth. To give but one example, just a new bead on a long string, the world's largest niobium deposit in Araxa belongs to an affiliate of the Niobium Corporation of New York. Niobium is alloyed with various other metals which, because of their resistance to high temperatures, are used in constructing nuclear reactors, rockets, spaceships, satellites, or simple jet planes. Along with niobium, the concern incidentally extracts substantial quantities of tantalum, thorium, uranium, pyrochlorate, and rare mineral-rich soils. The story of the rise and fall of nitrates is a good illustration of Latin America's illusory fortunes in the world market, how transient the blissful breezes have always been, how crushing the catastrophes. In the middle of the last century, Malthus' dark prophecies hovered over the old world. With Europe's population climbing steeply, it was urgently necessary to revive exhausted soil so that food production could grow in the same proportion. The value of guano as fertilizer was demonstrated in British laboratories, and after 1840 it began to be exported from Peru on a large scale. Since time immemorial, pelicans and seagulls, feeding on the prodigious shoals of fish in the coastal currents, have been accumulating mountains of excrement rich in nitrogen, ammonia, phosphates, and alkaline salts. On these rainless shores the guano had remained in a pure state. Soon after guano was launched in the international market, agricultural chemistry discovered even greater nutritive virtues in nitrate, and by 1850 it was being used intensively to fertilize European fields. Old world wheat growing lands, impoverished by erosion, hungrily absorbed the cargoes of sodium nitrate shipped from Tarapacá, then in Peru, and later from Antofagasta, then in Bolivia. Thanks to the sodium nitrate and the guano lying on Pacific coasts, almost within reach of the ships that came to fetch them, the specter of hunger departed from Europe. The uncommonly arrogant Lima oligarchy continued enriching itself and amassing symbols of its power in the palaces and Carrara marble mausoleums which sprouted amid sandy deserts. Once it had been Potosi's silver that nourished the great families of the capital city. Now they lived from bird droppings and the shiny white clots in the nitrate fields. More vulgar means to the same elegant ends. Peru thought it was independent, but Britain had taken Spain's place. The country felt rich, according to Jose Carlos Mariátegui, and the state carelessly used up its credit, living prodigally and mortgaging its future to British high finance. In 1868, the state's expenditures and debts far exceeded the value of its sales abroad. The guano deposits served as guarantee for British loans, and Europe juggled prices. The plunder of the exporters created havoc. What nature had accumulated over millennia on the islands was squandered in a few years. Meanwhile, out on the nitrate fields, the workers survived in hovels hardly higher than a man, made of stones, nitrate, rubble, and mud. The exploitation of saltpeter rapidly spread into Antofagasta, although the business was not Bolivian but Peruvian, and more than Peruvian, Chilean. When the Bolivian government proposed to tax those nitrate fields on its territory, the Chilean army invaded the province, never to leave. Until then, the desert had served as a damper on latent conflicts between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, but now nitrates brought them to the boil. The War on the Pacific broke out in 1879 and lasted till 1883. Chile's armed forces, having occupied the Peruvian nitrate ports of Patillos, Iquique, Pisagua, and Junín in 1879, finally entered Lima as conquerors, and the fortress of Callao surrendered the next day. The defeat brought mutilation and bloodletting to Peru. The national economy lost its two chief resources. Productive forces were paralyzed, the currency collapsed, and foreign credit was cut off. But as Barriategue notes, the collapse failed to wipe out the past. The colonial economic structure was untouched even though its sources of sustenance had been removed. As for Bolivia, it did not realize what the war had cost it. The most important copper mine today, Chuquicamata, lies in the province that lost to Chile. And the victors? Nitrate and iodine accounted for 5% of Chile's income in 1880. 10 years later, more than half came from the export of nitrates from the conquered territories. In the same period, British investments in Chile more than tripled. The nitrate region became a British factory. The English took over nitrates at bargain rates. The Peruvian government had expropriated the nitrate fields in 1875, paying for them in bonds. 5 years afterward, the war had reduced these documents to a tenth of their former value. Such daring adventurers as John Thomas North and his partner, Robert Harvey, turned this to good account. While Chileans, Peruvians, and Bolivians exchanged bullets on the field of battle, the English bought up the bonds, thanks to credits graciously afforded them by the Bank of Valparaiso and other Chilean banks. The soldiers were fighting for them without knowing it. The Chilean government promptly rewarded the sacrifices of North, Harvey, Inglis, James, Bush, Robertson, and other industrious businessmen in 1881, by which time half the bonds were in the hands of Britain's speculating wizards. It ordered the return of the nitrate fields to their legitimate owners. Not one penny had left England to finance this masterpiece of looting. In the early 1890s, Chile was sending 3/4 of its exports to Britain and getting almost half of its imports from that country. Its commercial dependence at the time was even greater than India's. The war had given Chile a world monopoly on natural nitrates, but the nitrate king was John Thomas North. One of his enterprises, the Liverpool Nitrate Company, was paying 40% in dividends. North had landed at Valparaiso in 1866 with only £10 in the pocket of his old dusty suit. 30 years later, princes and dukes, top politicians, and great industrialists sat at table in his London mansion. He had appointed himself colonel and, as befitted a gentleman of his standing, had joined the Conservative Party and the Kent Masonic Lodge. Lord Dorchester, Lord Randolph Churchill, and the Marquis of Stackpole graced his extravagant parties, where North danced in Henry VIII costume. Meanwhile, in his remote nitrate kingdom, Chileans put in 16-hour work days without even Sundays off, and were paid in scrip that lost about half its value at the company stores. Between 1886 and 1890, the Chilean state under President Jose Manuel Balmaceda undertook the most ambitious development plan in its history. Balmaceda promoted some industries, carried out important public works, modernized education, took measures to break the British railroad monopoly in Tarapacá, and secured from Germany the only non-British loan Chile received in the whole of the past century. He announced in 1888 that the nitrate areas must be nationalized through the formation of Chilean enterprises, and refused to sell state-owned nitrate fields to the British. 3 years later, civil war broke out. North and his colleagues generously financed the rebels, and British warships blockaded the Chilean coast, while the London press fulminated against Balmaceda, a butcher and dictator of the worst stripe. Balmaceda was defeated and killed himself. The British ambassador informed the Foreign Office, quote, "The British community makes no secret of its satisfaction over the fall of Balmaceda, whose victory, it is thought, would have implied serious harm to British commercial interests," end quote. State investments in roads, railways, colonization of new land, education, and public works promptly slumped as British enterprises extended their dominions. On the eve of World War I, two-thirds of Chile's national income came from nitrate exports. But it was a prosperity which, far from developing and diversifying, only heightened the country's structural deformations. Chile functioned as an appendage of the British economy. The biggest supplier of fertilizer to the European market had no right to its own life. And then a German chemist sitting in his laboratory defeated the generals who had won the day on the battlefield. Perfection of the Haber process, which produces nitrates by fixing nitrogen from the air, decisively displaced Chilean nitrate and sent Chile's economy into a tailspin. In the thirsty desert of Tamarugal, where the land dazzles one's eyes with its brilliance, I have stood beside the ruins of Tarapacá. During the boom, there were 120 nitrate fields here. Now only 2 remain in operation. Since the pampa is without moisture or moths, it was not only possible to sell the machinery as scrap, but also Oregon pine boards from the best houses, zinc sheets, and even intact nails, nuts, and bolts. Workers specializing in taking towns apart appeared on the scene. They were the only ones who could get a job in these raised and abandoned immensities. I saw the debris and the empty holes, the ghost towns, the dead tracks of the nitrate railway, the silent telegraph wires, the skeletons of nitrate fields mangled by the bombardment of years, the cemetery crosses buffeted at night by the cold wind, the whitish hills of slag piled up beside the excavations. Here money flowed and everyone thought it would never stop, I was told by the surviving residents. They idealized the past as a paradise. Even Sundays, which in 1889 did not exist for the workers and were won later by determined strike action, are remembered with nostalgia. Each Sunday on the nitrate pampa, a very old oldster said, was a national fiesta for us, a new Independence Day every week. Iquique, the biggest nitrate port, a first-class port according to its official citation, was the scene of more than one massacre of workers, but its municipal theater in the Belle Epoque style once drew Europe's best opera stars before they went to Santiago, the capital.